They say you don't just marry the person, you marry the family. What they don't tell you is what happens when that family includes someone who makes it their life's mission to destroy your marriage from the inside out. My name is Robert, and this is the story of how my mother-in-law tried to ruin my life and how I made sure she got exactly what she deserved. Eleanor Whitman was a force of nature, the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. At 62, she was still striking, with silver hair that she kept perfectly styled and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. She lived in a sprawling Victorian house in the most exclusive part of town, the same house where she had raised my wife Catherine and her two siblings. From the moment Catherine brought me home to meet her family 7 years ago, Eleanor made it clear that I wasn't good enough for her daughter. It wasn't anything she said directly. Eleanor was far too sophisticated for crude insults. Instead, she wielded her disapproval like a scalpel, making precise cuts designed to undermine my confidence and my relationship with Catherine. "Oh, Robert," she would say with that perfectly practiced smile. "How interesting that you chose to wear that tie with that shirt. I suppose not everyone has an eye for these things." Or when Catherine mentioned that we were thinking about buying a house. "Well, dear, I'm sure Robert is doing his best with his circumstances. Perhaps you should consider something more modest until his situation improves." My situation, as if being a successful software engineer wasn't good enough for the Whitman family standards. But I loved Catherine, and Catherine loved her mother, so I endured Eleanor's passive-aggressive attacks for the sake of my marriage. I told myself that she would eventually warm up to me. That time would prove I was worthy of her daughter's love. I was wrong. The attacks escalated after Catherine and I got married. Eleanor seemed to view our wedding not as a celebration, but as a declaration of war. She began a systematic campaign to undermine our marriage, always careful to maintain plausible deniability while slowly poisoning Catherine's mind against me. She would call Catherine every day, usually right around dinner time, with some urgent family matter that required immediate attention. She would invite Catherine to lunch and spend the entire meal pointing out the flaws in our relationship, always framed as concern for her daughter's happiness. "I just worry that you're settling, darling," she would say. "You're so young, and there are so many opportunities out there. Are you sure Robert is really the one?" Eleanor had a gift for planting seeds of doubt. She would mention how successful Catherine's college boyfriend had become, or point out attractive single men at social events, always with the implication that Catherine had made the wrong choice in marrying me. But the real damage came through 1,000 small cuts. Eleanor would forget to invite me to family gatherings, then act surprised when Catherine mentioned I felt excluded. She would give Catherine expensive gifts while pointedly ignoring me, or worse, giving me something obviously cheap and inappropriate. For our first Christmas as a married couple, Eleanor gave Catherine a beautiful diamond bracelet and gave me a book about improving your communication skills in marriage. The message was clear. Catherine was perfect, and I was the problem that needed fixing. The worst part was watching how Eleanor's constant criticism affected Catherine. My confident, independent wife began second-guessing herself, questioning our decisions, and pulling away from me emotionally. Eleanor was slowly but surely destroying our marriage, and she was doing it with surgical precision. The breaking point came during our 3rd year of marriage, when Catherine and I were trying to start a family. We had been trying for months without success, and Catherine was becoming increasingly anxious about it. Instead of supporting us through this difficult time, Eleanor saw it as an opportunity to drive another wedge between us. "You know, dear," she told Catherine during one of their weekly lunches, "fertility problems often run in the husband's family. Perhaps you should have Robert tested. It would be such a shame if his issues prevented you from having the children you deserve." Catherine came home from that lunch in tears, convinced that our fertility struggles were somehow my fault. When I suggested we both get tested, Eleanor's response was swift and devastating. "Oh, Robert," she said with that cold smile, "how defensive you're being. If you have nothing to hide, why are you so upset about a simple medical test?" The test results showed that there were no fertility issues on either side. We just needed to be patient. But Eleanor's seed of doubt had been planted, and Catherine began to wonder what other problems I might be hiding from her. That's when I realized that Eleanor wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law. She was a predator who had identified me as a threat to her control over Catherine, and she was systematically working to eliminate that threat. She wanted Catherine back under her influence, and she was willing to destroy our marriage to make that happen. I tried talking to Catherine about her mother's behavior, but Eleanor had been too clever. Every attack was subtle enough that Catherine could dismiss it as a misunderstanding or an overreaction on my part. When I pointed out the pattern of manipulation, Catherine accused me of being paranoid and jealous of her close relationship with her mother. "She's just protective," Catherine would say. "She wants what's best for me." "What's best for you is a marriage based on love and trust," I would reply. "Not constant interference from someone who's never given our relationship a fair chance." But Catherine couldn't see it. Eleanor had been manipulating her for so long that Catherine couldn't recognize the manipulation anymore. She had been conditioned to see her mother's criticism as love and my objections as selfishness. That's when I decided that Eleanor needed to learn what it felt like to have someone systematically undermine everything she valued. I spent months studying Eleanor's life, learning her routines, her relationships, her vulnerabilities. What I discovered was that beneath her polished exterior, Eleanor Whitman was a deeply insecure woman who had built her entire identity around being the perfect mother and the pillar of her social community. Eleanor's power came from her reputation. She was the president of the country club's charity committee, a board member of the local historical society, and the unofficial social coordinator for her circle of wealthy friends. She had spent decades cultivating an image of herself as a sophisticated, generous, and morally superior woman. But I also discovered that Eleanor's perfect image was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. She had been embezzling money from the charity committee for years, skimming small amounts from fundraising events and using the money to maintain her expensive lifestyle. She had been having an affair with a married man for over a decade, meeting him at a discreet hotel every Tuesday afternoon. And she had been spreading malicious gossip about her friends and neighbors, using her position as a trusted confidant to gather information that she could use against people when it suited her purposes. Eleanor Whitman was not the pillar of virtue she pretended to be. She was a fraud, a cheat, and a manipulator who had been getting away with it for years because no one had ever bothered to look beneath the surface. I decided it was time for people to see the real Eleanor Whitman. The plan I developed was complex and would unfold over several months, but it would ensure that Eleanor lost everything she valued: her reputation, her social standing, her financial security, and most importantly, her control over Catherine. Phase 1 involved documenting Eleanor's embezzlement from the charity committee. I volunteered to help with the committee's annual fundraising gala, which gave me access to their financial records. What I found was even worse than I had suspected. Over the past 5 years, Eleanor had stolen nearly $50,000 from various charity events. She had been careful to take small amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticed, but the pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. She had been using the money to pay for her expensive clothes, her luxury vacations, and her weekly spa treatments. I carefully documented every instance of theft, creating a detailed timeline with supporting evidence. I also discovered that Eleanor had been falsifying donation records, claiming that certain wealthy donors had given more money than they actually had, then pocketing the difference. Phase 2 involved exposing Eleanor's affair. Her lover was Richard Blackwood, a prominent local businessman who was married to one of Eleanor's closest friends. They had been meeting every Tuesday at the Riverside Inn, a small hotel about 30 minutes outside of town. I hired a private investigator to document their meetings, gathering photographs and video evidence of their affair. I also discovered that Eleanor had been using charity committee funds to pay for their hotel rooms, adding another layer to her financial crimes. Phase 3 was the most delicate. I needed to gather evidence of Eleanor's gossip and manipulation without alerting her to what I was doing. I began recording our conversations whenever she visited our house, using a small digital recorder that I kept hidden in my pocket. What I captured was devastating. Eleanor would arrive at our house full of malicious gossip about her friends and neighbors, sharing intimate details about their personal lives and financial problems. She would mock people behind their backs, making cruel comments about their appearances, their marriages, and their children. But most damaging of all, I recorded Eleanor's conversations with Catherine about our marriage. I heard her systematically undermining our relationship, planting doubts about my character, my faithfulness, and my love for Catherine. I heard her encouraging Catherine to consider divorce, suggesting that she would be better off without me. "You're still young and beautiful, darling," Eleanor said during one particularly vicious conversation. "You could have any man you wanted. Why are you wasting your life with someone who clearly doesn't appreciate what he has?" These recordings proved that Eleanor's interference in our marriage wasn't just protective mothering. It was a calculated campaign to destroy our relationship. Phase 4 involved Catherine's siblings, Eleanor's son Michael and daughter Patricia. Both of them had complicated relationships with their mother, but they had never been willing to confront her directly. Michael lived across the country and rarely visited, while Patricia maintained a polite but distant relationship with Eleanor. I reached out to both of them, sharing some of the evidence I had gathered about their mother's behavior. What I discovered was that Eleanor had been manipulating and controlling all of her children for years. Michael had moved across the country specifically to get away from his mother's interference, while Patricia had learned to keep her personal life completely separate from her family to avoid Eleanor's criticism and manipulation. Both siblings were shocked but not surprised by the evidence of their mother's crimes and affairs. They had always suspected that Eleanor wasn't the saint she pretended to be, but they had never had proof. "I've been waiting for someone to expose her for years," Patricia told me during a private conversation. "She's been getting away with this behavior for too long." With Michael and Patricia's support, I began planning the final phase of my revenge, a public exposure that would destroy Eleanor's reputation and remove her from our lives forever. The opportunity came during the Charity Committee's annual gala, the biggest social event of the year for Eleanor's circle. She had been planning the event for months, and it was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her tenure as committee president. Instead, it became the night that Eleanor Whitman's carefully constructed world came crashing down. I had arranged for several key pieces of evidence to be revealed during the gala. First, an anonymous tip led to an audit of the Charity Committee's finances, which revealed the full extent of Eleanor's embezzlement. The audit results were delivered to the committee's board of directors just as the gala was beginning. Second, I had arranged for Richard Blackwood's wife to receive copies of the photographs documenting his affair with Eleanor. She arrived at the gala in a fury, confronting both her husband and Eleanor in front of the entire gathering. Third, I had sent copies of Eleanor's most damaging recorded conversations to several of her closest friends, the same people she had been gossiping about and manipulating for years. They arrived at the gala armed with the knowledge of what Eleanor really thought about them. The confrontation was spectacular. Eleanor found herself surrounded by angry friends, betrayed colleagues, and shocked family members, all demanding explanations for her behavior. The woman who had spent years manipulating others through careful words and subtle implications was suddenly faced with undeniable evidence of her crimes and betrayals. "How could you steal from charity?" demanded the committee's treasurer. "We trusted you with that money. How could you sleep with my husband?" screamed Richard's wife. "I thought you were my friend. How could you say those horrible things about us behind our backs?" asked another friend, waving a transcript of one of Eleanor's recorded conversations. Eleanor tried to maintain her composure, but the evidence was overwhelming. She attempted to deny the charges, to claim that she was being framed, but too many people had seen too much proof. The final blow came when Catherine arrived at the gala and saw her mother surrounded by angry accusers. I had made sure that Catherine received copies of all the evidence, including the recordings of Eleanor's attempts to sabotage our marriage. For the first time, Catherine heard her mother's true voice, not the loving, concerned parent she pretended to be, but the manipulative, cruel woman who had been working to destroy our relationship for years. "Mom," Catherine said, her voice shaking with emotion, "is this true? Did you really say all these things about Robert? About our marriage?" Eleanor looked at her daughter, the person whose love and admiration she valued most in the world, and saw the disappointment and betrayal in Catherine's eyes. "Catherine, darling, you have to understand," Eleanor began, but Catherine cut her off. "I understand perfectly," Catherine said. "I understand that you've been lying to me for years. I understand that you've been trying to destroy my marriage because you can't stand the thought of me being happy with someone you can't control." The gala ended in chaos, with Eleanor fleeing the venue in disgrace. Within days, the story of her embezzlement and affair had spread throughout the community. She was forced to resign from all of her social positions, and criminal charges were filed for the theft of charity funds. Richard Blackwood's marriage ended in a very public and expensive divorce, and his business reputation was severely damaged by the scandal. Eleanor's affair had cost him everything, just as her manipulation had nearly cost me my marriage. But the most devastating consequence for Eleanor was the loss of her relationship with Catherine. My wife finally saw her mother for what she really was: a manipulative, selfish woman who had been willing to destroy her daughter's happiness to maintain her own control. Catherine cut off all contact with Eleanor, refusing to take her calls or respond to her letters. For the first time in her life, Eleanor was truly alone, abandoned by the daughter whose love she had taken for granted. The criminal trial lasted several months, but the outcome was never in doubt. Eleanor was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Her Victorian mansion was sold to pay restitution to the charity, and her carefully curated lifestyle came to an end. As for Catherine and me, our marriage not only survived Eleanor's attacks but emerged stronger than ever. Without her mother's constant interference and manipulation, Catherine was able to see our relationship clearly for the first time. She realized how much damage Eleanor's criticism had done to her self-confidence and her trust in me. "I'm so sorry," Catherine told me after Eleanor's conviction. "I should have seen what she was doing. I should have protected our marriage instead of letting her poison it." "You were conditioned to trust her," I replied. "She spent your entire life teaching you that her love was conditional on your obedience. It's not your fault that you couldn't see the manipulation." We went to counseling together, working through the damage that Eleanor's interference had caused to our relationship. Catherine learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation that her mother had used, and I learned to be more patient with the healing process. A year after Eleanor's conviction, Catherine and I renewed our wedding vows in a small ceremony attended only by our closest friends and Catherine's siblings. It was the wedding we should have had the first time, a celebration of our love without the shadow of Eleanor's disapproval hanging over us. Eleanor was released from prison after serving 18 months of her sentence. She moved to a small apartment in another state, far from the community where she had once been a social leader. She tried to contact Catherine several times, but my wife had learned to recognize her mother's manipulation tactics and refused to be drawn back into that toxic relationship. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about destroying Eleanor's life so completely. They wonder if my revenge was too harsh, if I should have found a way to resolve our conflict without exposing her crimes and destroying her reputation. But they don't understand what it's like to watch someone systematically destroy your marriage while pretending to love your spouse. They don't know what it feels like to be gaslit and manipulated for years by someone who smiles to your face while stabbing you in the back. Eleanor made her choices long before I exposed them. She chose to steal from charity. She chose to have an affair with a married man. She chose to manipulate and control her children. She chose to try to destroy my marriage because she couldn't stand the thought of losing control over Catherine. I simply made sure that her choices had consequences. The woman who had spent years trying to convince Catherine that I wasn't good enough for her learned what it felt like to lose everything she valued. The woman who had used her reputation as a weapon against others discovered what happened when that reputation was destroyed. Eleanor Whitman got exactly what she deserved, and Catherine and I got the chance to build a marriage based on love and trust, free from the toxic influence of someone who had never wanted us to succeed. Today, Catherine and I have been married for 7 years, and we have 2 beautiful children who will never know their grandmother's manipulation. We've built a life together that's based on honesty, respect, and genuine love. Everything that Eleanor tried to prevent us from having. The best revenge isn't just exposing someone's crimes or destroying their reputation. It's building a life so good that their absence makes it even better. Eleanor spent years trying to convince Catherine that she would be happier without me. Instead, we discovered that we were both happier without her.